A baby shower only happens once, my mother said over the phone, 3 weeks before my wedding, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she'd already made up her mind about something. Your wedding? Well, you'll have plenty of anniversaries to celebrate later. Rachel's shower is just that one day. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, staring at the invitation for my own wedding sitting on the counter, understanding, with a clarity that still aches even now, exactly how my parents had just ranked their 2 grandchildren to be against their own daughter's marriage. 2 years later, they needed somewhere to stay. I was not the family member they called first. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, hit the like button now. If you've ever stayed silent while someone underestimated you, comment here below. And subscribe to Story Retribution because today's ending proves that karma always arrives, just not when people expect it. My cousin Rachel and I grew up close in age, close enough in childhood that our families often treated us almost like siblings during holidays and summer visits. But somewhere along the way, particularly after Rachel married into a wealthier family and began building what my parents seemed to view as a more impressive life, the dynamic between us shifted into something quietly, persistently competitive, at least from my parents' perspective. I never felt that competitiveness myself. I loved Rachel genuinely, was thrilled when she got pregnant with her first child, and never once viewed her happiness as something diminishing my own. But my parents, I began noticing over the years, seemed to hold Rachel's milestones up as somehow more significant than my own, celebrating her promotions more enthusiastically than mine, mentioning her husband's income more frequently than seemed necessary, treating her pregnancy announcement with an excitement that felt even then disproportionate compared to how they'd responded to my own engagement months earlier. The small betrayal happened during the engagement itself, when I called my parents with the exciting news that my boyfriend of 4 years, Marcus, had proposed. My mother's response, while warm, included an almost immediate comparison. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You know, Rachel just told us she and David are trying for their first baby. What an exciting time for the whole family." I remember feeling a small, unsettling deflation at how quickly the conversation shifted toward Rachel's news rather than lingering on my own. The bigger betrayal crystallized 3 weeks before my wedding, when Rachel announced her baby shower date, and it happened to fall on the exact same Saturday as my wedding, a scheduling conflict that had existed for months, but that neither Rachel nor my parents had thought urgent enough to address, until suddenly it became unavoidable. I called my mother, initially assuming this was simply an oversight that could be resolved easily. "I'm sure Rachel can move the shower," I said. "The wedding date has been set for almost a year." The silence on the phone lasted just long enough for dread to settle into my stomach before my mother responded. "Actually, sweetheart," she said carefully, "we were hoping you'd understand if we attended Rachel's shower instead. A baby shower only happens once. Your wedding, well, you'll have plenty of anniversaries to celebrate later. Rachel's shower is just that one day." I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what my mother had just said, trying to understand how my own wedding, a day I had been planning for nearly a year, was somehow less significant than a single afternoon celebrating a pregnancy. "You're not coming to my wedding?" I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "We'll be there in spirit," my mother said, her tone suggesting this should be an obvious, reasonable compromise. "And we'll absolutely make it up to you afterward. We just feel like Rachel really needs the family support right now, especially since this is her first pregnancy." I hung up that call feeling something crack quietly inside me, a specific foundational understanding that my parents had, when directly forced to choose, prioritized my cousin's single-day celebration over my actual wedding. My wedding happened 3 weeks later, beautiful despite the ache of my parents' empty seats in the front row, Marcus's family and my closest friends filling the space where my own parents should have been, offering warmth and support that, while genuinely appreciated, couldn't fully replace the specific grief of celebrating one of the most significant days of my life without them present. My parents attended Rachel's baby shower that same afternoon, sending me a brief, cheerful video call during the reception, my mother holding up her phone to show me decorations, apologizing quickly before returning to the celebration, promising again they'd make it up to me soon. They never fully did. Over the following 2 years, small moments continued reinforcing the same pattern: enthusiastic attendance at every one of Rachel's baby milestones, first birthday parties, elaborate holiday gatherings centered around Rachel's growing family, while my own life, my marriage, continued receiving a noticeably more muted level of engagement and interest. I didn't confront them directly during this period, choosing instead to quietly protect my own peace, building a genuinely happy life with Marcus, maintaining polite but increasingly distant relationships with my parents, understanding, gradually, that whatever comparison they'd created between Rachel and me wasn't something I could fix through more effort or patience on my part. Then, about 4 months ago, my father called me, his voice carrying a tension I hadn't heard from him before. "We need to talk about something difficult," he said. "Your mother and I are having some financial trouble. The retirement savings didn't stretch as far as we planned, and with rising costs, we're looking at potentially needing to downsize significantly, maybe even move in with family for a while until we get back on our feet." I felt a complicated mixture of concern and something harder to name. Listening to my father describe a situation serious enough that they were considering asking to move in with someone. "We were actually hoping," my father continued, "that we might be able to stay with Rachel and David for a few months. Their house is spacious, and we're already so close with them." I sat with that statement for a long moment, understanding fully, with a clarity that felt almost surreal, that even now, facing genuine financial hardship, my parents' first instinct wasn't to ask their own daughter for help, but to turn toward the niece they'd consistently prioritized over me for years. "Have you asked Rachel yet?" I asked carefully. "We're planning to call her this week," my father said. "I wanted to give you a heads up first, since obviously you're still family too." I hung up that call feeling something complicated settle over me. Not quite anger, not quite hurt, but a kind of clear, exhausted recognition of exactly how consistently this pattern had repeated itself throughout my adult life. 2 weeks later, my mother called me again, her voice noticeably different this time, smaller, more hesitant than I'd heard from her in years. "Rachel said no," she said quietly. "She and David are dealing with their own financial stretch right now, apparently, with the kids' school costs and everything. She suggested we look into a retirement community instead, or maybe reach out to you and Marcus." "Wait, what?" I said, genuinely surprised despite everything, unable to fully process that Rachel, the family member my parents had consistently prioritized, had declined to help them during an actual crisis. "I know this is difficult, given everything," my mother said carefully, clearly recognizing, finally, the specific weight of the situation. "But we really don't have many other options right now. Would you and Marcus possibly consider letting us stay with you, just temporarily, while we figure out our next steps?" I sat with that request for several long, complicated moments, memories moving rapidly through my mind. The empty seats at my wedding, years of enthusiastic attendance at Rachel's family milestones, alongside muted acknowledgement of my own. The casual assumption that Rachel would obviously be their first choice even now, during genuine financial hardship. I didn't say no immediately, though I understood, sitting there, that I finally needed to have an honest conversation with my parents about a pattern they'd never fully acknowledged or addressed. "I need to be honest with you," I said slowly. "It's difficult for me to process being asked as a backup option after everything." My mother's voice grew quiet on the other end of the line. "What do you mean?" "You skipped my wedding for Rachel's baby shower," I said, my voice steady despite years of unspoken hurt finally surfacing. "You've spent the past several years celebrating every single milestone in her life with more enthusiasm than you've shown for mine. And now, facing an actual crisis, your first call wasn't to me. It was only after Rachel said no that you thought to ask." The silence on the phone stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped entirely. "I didn't realize," my mother said finally, her voice thick with what sounded like genuine, dawning understanding, "how deeply that decision about the wedding actually affected you. I convinced myself at the time that you'd understand, that missing one day wouldn't really matter in the grand scheme of things." "It mattered," I said quietly. "It's mattered every single time since then, watching you show up fully for Rachel while treating my milestones as somehow less significant." My father, apparently listening on speakerphone, finally spoke. "We made a mistake," he said, his voice heavier than I'd heard from him in years. We got caught up in something with Rachel, some misguided sense that her life looked more impressive, more worth celebrating loudly, and we let that affect how we showed up for you. That's on us completely, not something you did wrong. I felt something complicated shift inside me, hearing that acknowledgement, years of quiet hurt, finally being named directly rather than continuing to sit unspoken beneath the surface of every family interaction. The family reactions unfolded slowly over the following weeks. My parents, humbled significantly by Rachel's refusal to help during their actual crisis, began engaging with me more honestly, more consistently than they had in years. Finally, painfully, recognizing the specific ways they'd prioritized appearances and comparisons over genuine equal support for both their daughter and their niece. I agreed, eventually, to help them temporarily, though not without clear boundaries and honest conversations about the pattern that needed to change moving forward. Marcus and I set up a small living arrangement, my parents contributing what they could financially while working toward more permanent housing solutions. Rachel, when I eventually spoke with her about everything, seemed genuinely uncomfortable learning the full extent of how my parents had prioritized her over me for years, admitting she'd noticed some of the pattern herself, but hadn't fully grasped its depth until hearing my side directly. I didn't feel triumphant, watching my parents finally acknowledge years of favoritism they'd never previously named directly. I felt something steadier and more complicated. Relief that the pattern was finally being addressed honestly, layered with lingering grief for a wedding day I could never fully get back. For years of milestones celebrated with noticeably less enthusiasm than my cousin's equivalent moments. The emotional resolution that followed wasn't instant or perfect. Living with my parents temporarily required patience, honest conversations, and consistent boundary setting as we worked through years of unspoken imbalance. But something genuine began rebuilding between us, built now on actual acknowledgement rather than the quiet, unexamined favoritism that had shaped so much of our relationship previously. The final lesson settled over me slowly, months into this new arrangement, watching my parents show up consistently, genuinely, for ordinary Tuesday dinners and small daily moments in a way they'd rarely managed for my bigger milestones over the years. My parents had spent years assuming that comparing my life unfavorably against Rachel's, prioritizing her celebrations over my own significant moments, carried no real cost, that I would simply continue accepting a secondary role in their attention indefinitely, without consequence. They mistook my patience and understanding for something that would never require honest reckoning. They never imagined that the same daughter they'd treated as a lower priority for years would ultimately become the one they needed most during an actual crisis, or that finally being forced to ask directly would require confronting honestly exactly how consistently they'd chosen appearances over genuine equal love for both their daughter and their niece. I never raised my voice during that difficult phone call. I didn't need to. Years of quiet, accumulated hurt, finally spoken clearly and honestly, said everything that needed saying about a pattern that had gone unacknowledged for far too long. Karma doesn't announce itself with shouting. It doesn't arrive the moment betrayal happens. Sometimes it simply arrives as an honest phone call, forcing a long overdue reckoning with exactly who actually shows up when it matters most. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments. What would you have done in my situation? If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, emotional drama, shocking revenge, and the justice that always finds its way back, subscribe to Story Retribution and turn on the bell so you never miss the next story. Tomorrow's story might be even more unbelievable. See you then.